An elderly lighthouse keeper discovers a mother and daughter hiding from danger. He uncovers a shocking connection to his past that changes everything. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we begin this incredible journey. The autumn wind whipped salt spray against the weathered lighthouse windows as Thomas Everett climbed the spiral stairs for what he thought might be his final time. At 72 years old, his arthritis protested each step, but duty called louder than pain. The beacon point light had guided ships safely home for 87 years, and he had been its keeper for the last 29. Tomorrow, the Coast Guard would install an automated system. Progress, they called it. Thomas called it the end of an era. The massive lens required careful adjustment, its beam sweeping across the churning Atlantic waters below. The storm approaching from the northeast would be fierce, possibly the last real test of his skills as keeper. He had weathered countless storms in his years at the lighthouse, each one teaching him something new about the ocean's power and the importance of maintaining that guiding light. Ships depended on that beam to navigate safely through treacherous waters, just as he had once depended on his work to navigate through his own troubled past. As he descended the stairs, checking the generator and emergency supplies one final time, a sound caught his attention above the howling wind. Voices, human voices, coming from the small supply shed behind the lighthouse cottage. Thomas paused, listening carefully. The voices were female, one older, one younger, speaking in urgent whispers that carried desperation even through the storm's roar. In all his years as keeper, few people had ever ventured this far out during severe weather. Thomas grabbed his heavy coat and stepped into the storm. The rain had begun, fat drops that stung his weathered face as he made his way toward the shed. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path he had walked thousands of times before. Through a gap in the wooden planks, he saw them. A woman in her 30s with dark hair plastered to her skull, holding a girl who couldn't be more than 10 years old. Both were soaked through, shivering uncontrollably in the approaching storm. "Hello in there," Thomas called out, keeping his voice gentle but loud enough to be heard over the wind. "I'm the lighthouse keeper. You're trespassing on Coast Guard property, but storms trump regulations. Come inside before you catch pneumonia." The woman's eyes widened with fear as she pulled her daughter closer. This wasn't just concern about the storm or being caught trespassing. This was deeper, older fear, the kind that came from being hunted by something far more dangerous than wind and rain. The woman hesitated, years of caution warring with desperation and exhaustion. Her clothes, though soaked, were expensive. Her manner of speaking when she finally responded carried the refinement of education and privilege. Yet here she was, hiding in a storage shed during a storm with a child who looked as frightened as she did. "We're not causing trouble," she said through chattering teeth, her voice carrying a Boston accent. "We'll leave as soon as the storm passes." Thomas studied their faces through the gap, noting the way the woman positioned herself protectively between him and the child. The girl's eyes were wide with exhaustion and hunger, dark circles beneath them suggesting they hadn't slept properly in days. When Thomas asked directly about their last meal, the little girl's stomach answered with a loud rumble that made her blush with embarrassment. The woman's resolve crumbled slightly at her daughter's obvious distress. "Yesterday morning," she whispered, the admission clearly painful. The simple words told Thomas everything he needed to know about their desperation. No one sought shelter in a lighthouse storage shed during a storm unless they had run out of better options. No mother let her child go hungry unless circumstances had stripped away every alternative. These weren't casual travelers caught in bad weather. These were refugees from something terrible. "Well then, regulations be damned," Thomas declared, pushing open the shed door against the wind. "I'm Thomas Everett, and you're coming inside right now. I've got soup on the stove and a fireplace that needs tending." The woman introduced herself as Sarah, her daughter as Lucy. There wouldn't be any trouble, she promised, though Thomas could see trouble had already found them long before they'd found his lighthouse. The Lighthouse cottage was small but warm, filled with the scent of homemade vegetable soup and the crackle of burning driftwood in the fireplace. Thomas had learned to cook out of necessity during his years alone, and the simple meal seemed to affect Sarah more deeply than mere food should. She watched as he bustled around the kitchen, slicing homemade bread and setting out bowls, as if kindness without strings attached was something she had forgotten existed. Sarah and Lucy sat at the small kitchen table, their wet clothes replaced with dry blankets, while their own clothes hung steaming near the fire. Lucy attacked her bowl of soup with desperate hunger, manners momentarily forgotten in the face of genuine need. Sarah ate more slowly, but Thomas noticed how she kept glancing toward the windows, jumping at every gust of wind that rattled the panes. Her hypervigilance was constant, exhausting to witness. "Where are you folks from?" Thomas asked casually, settling into his worn recliner with his own bowl. The question seemed to cause Sarah physical discomfort, her shoulders tensing as if preparing for a blow. "Boston," she replied, then immediately looked like she regretted saying even that much. Her hand moved instinctively to her wrist, where Thomas caught a glimpse of what looked like fingerprint bruises fading to yellow. Thomas nodded, pretending not to notice her discomfort while mentally cataloguing the signs he recognized from his merchant marine days. The flinching at sudden movements, the way she positioned herself between Lucy and any perceived threat, the careful monitoring of exits. "Long way to travel in weather like this," he observed neutrally. "Car breakdown?" Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter ocean. "Something like that." The conversation continued in careful circles, Thomas providing gentle questions while Sarah revealed fragments of their story. They had left in the middle of the night 3 days ago. The decision had been sudden, born of desperation rather than planning. "We had to leave quickly," Sarah explained, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Middle of the night kind of quickly." The way she said it told Thomas everything he needed to know about domestic violence. Lucy had remained mostly quiet during this exchange, focused on her soup, but clearly listening to every word. At 10 years old, she had already learned to read adult conversations for signs of danger, to interpret silences and half-truths for their real meaning. When Thomas asked if she liked the soup, she nodded enthusiastically, then added softly, "It's the best thing I've eaten in a long time." The innocent comment revealed more about their recent circumstances than hours of careful questioning might have. "Running from him," Thomas said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. Sarah's composure cracked, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as she nodded confirmation. The relief of having someone understand without judgment was visible in the way her shoulders finally relaxed slightly. "Dr. Marcus Whitfield," she whispered, as if saying the name too loudly might summon the man himself. "My husband, Boston's most respected cardiac surgeon." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow, 30 years of buried memories rising to the surface like debris from a shipwreck. His soup bowl slipped from suddenly numb fingers, clattering against the table. The sound made both Sarah and Lucy jump, their trained fear responses activated by the unexpected noise. "You know him," Sarah whispered, seeing the recognition in Thomas's eyes, the way his face had gone pale despite his weathered complexion. Thomas nodded slowly, his mind racing through implications he had never imagined possible. The cruel symmetry of fate had brought the family of his old enemy directly to his doorstep, seeking the same kind of help he had once desperately needed. 30 years ago, I wasn't a lighthouse keeper, he began, his voice steady despite the emotional upheaval. I was chief engineer on a research vessel called the Aurora. We were investigating pollution in Boston Harbor for the EPA. Sarah leaned forward, sensing the importance of what was coming. Lucy continued eating, but Thomas could see she was listening intently, her young mind trying to process adult complexities that no child should have to understand. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cottage, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and Thomas's quiet voice as he began to unravel a story 30 years in the making. Marcus was just finishing his residency then, but already making a name for himself. Thomas continued, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Brilliant surgeon, they said. Charming, wealthy, destined for greatness. What they didn't know was that he was also dumping medical waste illegally into the harbor through a company he secretly owned. Toxic materials that were poisoning the water supply and killing marine life by the thousands. The cottage fell silent except for the storm raging outside and the steady rhythm of the lighthouse beam sweeping past their windows. Sarah's hand had moved to cover her mouth in shock, while Lucy had stopped eating entirely, sensing the gravity of what was being revealed. Thomas forced himself to continue, to speak truths he had carried alone for 3 decades. "I found the evidence," he said, his voice growing harder with remembered pain. Chemical signatures that matched exactly with the medical waste from his hospital. Shipping manifests that traced back to his shell company. Financial records that showed the payments. Everything needed to prove his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the environment and public health. Sarah reached across the small table, her hand covering his weathered one in a gesture of comfort and shared understanding. "What happened when you tried to report it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would not be pleasant. "Suddenly my findings were questioned," Thomas replied bitterly. "My methods were called into doubt. I was accused of falsifying data, of having a personal vendetta against successful doctors. Marcus had connections everywhere, in the hospital administration, the university, the EPA itself. Within 6 months, I was stripped of my credentials and blacklisted in the scientific community. The revelation settled between them, like a bridge, spanning 30 years of injustice and pain." Sarah's fingers tightened around his hand as she began to understand the full scope of Marcus's capacity for destruction. "He ruined your career," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of recognition. She had seen this same pattern of systematic destruction applied to anyone who dared to cross her husband. "More than that," Thomas said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "My wife Margaret couldn't handle the scandal, the financial pressure, the constant stress of being married to someone labeled as a fraud. She left me, took our daughter Emily with her. Said she couldn't be married to a failure, couldn't raise her child in the shadow of my disgrace." The pain of that abandonment was still fresh after all these years. Lucy looked up from her bowl, her young face serious with concern. "Where are they now?" she asked innocently. Thomas smiled sadly at her compassion. "I don't know, sweetheart. They moved away, changed their names. I haven't seen or heard from them in 28 years." The admission hung in the air, a testament to Marcus Whitfield's ability to destroy not just careers, but entire families. The conversation was interrupted by Lucy, speaking up with sudden urgency. "Mom, who's that man outside?" She was pointing toward the window that faced the road, her voice carrying the particular tension children develop when they've learned that unexpected visitors usually mean trouble. Thomas and Sarah turned toward the window Lucy indicated. Through the rain-streaked glass, barely visible in the lighthouse beam's sweep, stood a figure in a dark coat. The person was motionless despite the driving rain, watching the cottage with the patience of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Even at this distance, there was something deliberate and menacing about the figure's posture. "He found us," Sarah breathed, terror flooding her features as color drained from her face. Her entire body began to tremble, the carefully maintained composure of the past few hours crumbling in an instant. Lucy immediately moved closer to her mother, instinctively seeking protection, while her own eyes remained fixed on the threatening figure outside. Thomas rose quickly, moving to the window for a better look. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but there was something unmistakably deliberate about the way he stood, unmoving despite the storm's fury. This wasn't someone seeking shelter or lost in the weather. This was someone who had tracked his quarry to this remote location and was now deciding how to proceed. "How long has he been there, sweetheart?" Thomas asked Lucy, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. Years of maritime emergencies had taught him to think clearly under pressure, and right now, clear thinking was exactly what they needed. "Just now," Lucy replied, shrinking closer to her mother. "He appeared when the light came around." Her observation was precise, the kind of detail that suggested she had learned to pay careful attention to her surroundings. Children who grew up in dangerous households developed survival skills that no child should need. Thomas's mind raced through their options. If Marcus had indeed found them, they were effectively trapped. The lighthouse sat on a narrow peninsula with only one road leading to and from the mainland. The storm made escape by boat impossible, even if they had access to one. They were sitting ducks in what should have been a sanctuary. "Sarah," he said urgently, "take Lucy upstairs to the bedroom. There's a radio up there. Call the Coast Guard station and tell them we have an emergency situation requiring immediate assistance." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to handling crises, but Sarah could hear the underlying concern that he was trying to hide for Lucy's sake. Sarah stood on unsteady legs, pulling Lucy with her toward the narrow staircase that led to the lighthouse's upper levels. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice tight with fear, but also with a growing determination. The fragile woman who had sought shelter was beginning to be replaced by the protective mother who would fight for her child's safety. Thomas moved to an old sea chest in the corner of the room, withdrawing something wrapped in oiled cloth. "What I should have done 30 years ago," he said grimly, unwrapping what appeared to be a flare gun along with several emergency flares. "Stand my ground and refuse to be intimidated." His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the weapon, muscle memory from his maritime days taking over. The figure outside began moving closer to the cottage, his silhouette becoming clearer with each sweep of the lighthouse beam. Tall, confident, moving with the arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way. Even through the storm, his expensive clothing was evident, as was the predatory grace with which he approached the cottage. "Thomas," Sarah called from the top of the stairs, her voice tight with panic. "The radio's not working. The storm must have knocked out the communication tower." The news hit Thomas like a physical blow, eliminating their most direct connection to help and leaving them truly isolated with a dangerous man approaching. Thomas felt his heart sink, but his resolve remained firm. He had spent 30 years running from this confrontation, 30 years living with the knowledge that Marcus Whitfield had destroyed his life and gotten away with it. Tonight, that pattern was going to end. He moved to the front door, checking the locks, then positioning himself at the window with the best view of the approaching figure. "Stay upstairs," he called back to Sarah and Lucy. "No matter what happens, don't come down until I tell you it's safe." His voice carried the weight of absolute command, the tone of someone who had made life or death decisions in maritime emergencies and knew the importance of being obeyed without question. The knock that came at the door was measured, controlled, the knock of a man who expected to be answered immediately. Thomas waited, letting it repeat twice before responding, using the time to steady his nerves and prepare for what he knew would be the most important confrontation of his life. "Dr. Whitfield, I presume," he called through the door, his voice carrying across the years of pain and injustice. Even saying the name aloud after all this time felt like exercising a long-buried ghost, giving form to the nightmare that had shaped his life for 3 decades. "I've come for my wife and daughter," came the reply, voice smooth and cultured despite the storm. Even through the door, Marcus's voice carried that same dangerous charm that had fooled so many people over the years. "I know they're in there. Send them out, and we can all go home peacefully." Thomas opened the door, but kept the chain lock engaged, allowing only a narrow gap through which he could see his old enemy. The years had been kind to Marcus Whitfield. Still handsome, still radiating that same dangerous charm that had made him so effective at manipulating others. His expensive coat was soaked through, but he seemed oblivious to the discomfort, focused entirely on his objective. "They're not going anywhere with you," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying 30 years of suppressed anger and determination. Face to face with Marcus after all this time, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if this moment had been inevitable since that day his career was destroyed. Marcus's smile was cold as winter ocean, an expression Thomas remembered all too well from their previous encounters. "Thomas Everett," he said with mock surprise, "I wondered if you were still alive. Still playing the failed hero, I see." The casual cruelty in his voice was unchanged, still wielding words like weapons designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. "Still standing up to bullies who think money makes them untouchable," Thomas replied evenly, refusing to be baited into anger that might cloud his judgment. He had learned patience during his years of lighthouse keeping, and that patience was serving him well now in this crucial confrontation. Marcus's facade cracked slightly, revealing the cold calculation beneath his charm. "You cost me considerable trouble 30 years ago, old man. I had to spend a fortune covering up your meddling, discrediting you, making sure your findings never saw the light of day. But it worked out in the end. You were thoroughly discredited, and I went on to build an empire." Thomas felt 30 years of buried anger rising to the surface, but he channeled it into determination rather than rage. "Built on lies and other people's suffering," he said through gritted teeth. "Built on the bodies of people you've hurt, the families you've destroyed, the environment you've poisoned. Built on understanding how the world really works," Marcus corrected, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he used with students and subordinates. "The strong take what they want, and the weak accept what they're given. Sarah and Lucy belong to me. They're my family, my property, and I've come to reclaim what's mine." The casual way Marcus referred to his wife and daughter as property confirmed everything Thomas had suspected about the man's character. "People aren't property," he said firmly, his voice carrying the moral conviction that had gotten him in trouble 30 years ago and was driving him to take a stand now. Marcus laughed, the sound chilling even above the storm's howl. "Everything is property to someone who has the power to claim it. Money, influence, connections, these things give you ownership over whatever you choose to possess." "You learned that lesson once, Everett. Don't make me teach it to you again." The threat was clear and personal, but Thomas didn't back down. Years of solitude had given him time to think, to plan, to prepare for possibilities he had never dared hope might come to pass. "I'm not the same broken man you destroyed 3 decades ago, Whitfield. I've had time to think, to plan, to prepare for this moment." Marcus's eyes narrowed with suspicion and growing concern. For the first time in their conversation, he seemed to sense that this confrontation might not go according to his usual script. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice losing some of its confident authority. Thomas smiled grimly, reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a thick manila envelope. The package was weathered but carefully preserved, containing documentation that represented 30 years of patient investigation and careful evidence gathering. "You made one mistake 30 years ago, Marcus. You assumed destroying my reputation would make me disappear. Instead, it gave me motivation to keep investigating." The doctor's confident expression faltered as he stared at the envelope, beginning to understand that Thomas wasn't bluffing. 30 years of documentation, Thomas continued relentlessly. Chemical analysis reports, shipping records, witness statements, All the original evidence you thought was destroyed, plus everything I've uncovered since. Environmental crimes, tax evasion, medical malpractice covered up by your hospital's board. Marcus stared at the envelope, his face paling, despite the cold rain still driving against him. Even if that's true, who would believe you now? A washed-up lighthouse keeper with a grudge against a respected surgeon. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction, and Thomas could see the fear beginning to crack through his arrogant facade. Thomas's smile widened as he played his final card. Funny thing about being isolated for 30 years. Gives a man time to make friends in interesting places. Investigative journalists who specialize in exposing corrupt doctors. Federal prosecutors who've been looking for a way to bring down untouchable criminals. Environmental groups with very long memories. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. For the first time in decades, he was facing an opponent who couldn't be intimidated, bought off, or discredited. Thomas had spent 30 years building a network of allies and gathering evidence, all in preparation for this moment. "You're lying," Marcus said, but his voice carried desperation rather than conviction. "The envelope goes to the Boston Globe, the EPA and the FBI tomorrow morning." Thomas continued relentlessly, pressing his advantage, while Marcus reeled from the implications. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to discuss terms." The tables had turned completely from their confrontation 30 years ago, and both men knew it. Marcus's hand moved to his coat pocket, and Thomas tensed, gripping the flare gun more tightly. But what the doctor withdrew wasn't a weapon. It was a cell phone, though his hands were shaking too much to operate it effectively in the storm. "I'll have you arrested for kidnapping," he threatened, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Thomas laughed, the sound carrying years of suppressed satisfaction. "With what evidence? 2 women sought shelter during a storm. I provided humanitarian aid. The only crime here is you stalking your family across state lines, terrorizing them with threats of violence." The legal reality of the situation was clearly in Thomas's favor, and Marcus was beginning to realize it. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Rain driving against the cottage as the lighthouse beams swept over them repeatedly. Marcus was clearly calculating his options, trying to find a way to salvage control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his expectations. Finally, he spoke again, his voice different now, less commanding, more calculating. "What do you want, Everett?" The question represented a fundamental shift in their dynamic. For the first time in their relationship, Marcus was asking rather than demanding, negotiating rather than simply taking what he wanted. "Justice," Thomas replied simply. "You leave Sarah and Lucy alone, forever. No contact, no threats, no attempts to find them or control them. In exchange, I'll consider holding on to my evidence for the time being." The terms were clear and non-negotiable, spoken with the authority of someone who finally held all the cards. Marcus's jaw worked silently as he weighed his options. The storm continued to rage around them, but the real tempest was in his mind as he faced the possibility of losing everything he had built through decades of manipulation and intimidation. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though they both knew he had very little choice in the matter. "Then by tomorrow night, your face will be on every news channel in New England," Thomas replied with cold satisfaction. "Dr. Marcus Whitfield, respected surgeon and environmental criminal, wife beater and stalker. Let's see how quickly your hospital board distances themselves from that scandal, how fast your wealthy patients find new doctors." The chess match continued in silence, each man evaluating his position. Marcus clearly hadn't expected this level of resistance, especially not from someone he'd considered thoroughly defeated decades ago. The realization that Thomas had spent 30 years preparing for this moment was beginning to sink in, along with the understanding that his usual tactics were powerless here. "You think you've won," Marcus said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "But you have no idea who you're dealing with. I have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach into every level of government." But even as he spoke the words, they sounded hollow, the desperate threats of a man whose power was slipping away. Thomas remained unmoved by the bluster. "And I have nothing left to lose," he replied calmly. "That makes me far more dangerous than your money and connections. You destroyed my life once, took away everything I cared about. Now I have a chance to protect others from the same fate, and I won't waste it." Another sweep of the lighthouse beam illuminated Marcus's face, revealing something Thomas hadn't seen before: genuine uncertainty. The doctor was realizing that his usual tactics of intimidation and legal manipulation might not work against a man who had already lost everything once and survived. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "I need time to consider your proposal," Marcus said finally, the words clearly painful for someone accustomed to immediate capitulation from his opponents. The admission that he needed time was itself a victory for Thomas, proof that the power dynamic had truly shifted. Thomas shook his head firmly. "You have until the storm passes. After that, Sarah and Lucy disappear to somewhere you'll never find them, and you go back to Boston to face whatever consequences I decide you've earned." End of story. The ultimatum was delivered with quiet authority, brooking no negotiation. Marcus stepped back from the door, his expensive shoes squelching in the mud that the storm had created around the cottage. "This isn't over, Everett," he said, but the threat sounded more like the desperate words of a defeated man than the confident promise of someone in control. "Yes," Thomas replied firmly, beginning to close the door. "It is." As Marcus retreated into the darkness, Thomas finally allowed himself to breathe. But he knew this was only the first round. Men like Marcus Whitfield didn't surrender easily, and the storm provided cover for all sorts of dangerous activities. Upstairs, Sarah and Lucy had heard every word through the old cottage's thin walls. When Thomas climbed the narrow stairs, moving carefully in the darkness, he found them huddled together on the small bed, Lucy clinging to her mother while Sarah stroked her hair with trembling hands. "Is he gone?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the continuing storm. The fear in her eyes was mixed now with something else, a growing hope that maybe, just maybe, their nightmare might finally be ending. Thomas nodded, settling into the room's only chair with a weary sigh. "For now, but he'll be back. Men like him always come back, especially when they feel their control slipping away." His honesty was tempered with reassurance as he continued. "But this time, he's not dealing with victims. He's dealing with people who are prepared to fight back." Sarah's face showed the internal struggle between years of conditioning and the new possibility of freedom. "Then it was all for nothing," she said, despair creeping into her voice. "Running, hiding, putting you in danger. He'll never let us go. Marcus doesn't accept defeat." Thomas leaned forward, his voice gentle but determined. "That's where you're wrong, Sarah. Marcus Whitfield built his power on other people's fear and silence, but secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when someone's willing to shine a beacon on them." He gestured toward the lighthouse beam sweeping past the window, a metaphor for the truth that could no longer be hidden. Lucy looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "How, Mr. Thomas? How can we stop someone so powerful?" Her question carried the wisdom of a child who had seen too much of adult cruelty, but still believed in the possibility of justice. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. "By doing what lighthouse keepers do best, sweetheart. By making sure everyone can see clearly what's really happening in the darkness, no matter how hard some people try to hide it." The metaphor resonated through the small room, carrying the promise of truth finally coming to light. As dawn approached after the long, sleepless night, the storm began to weaken. But inside the lighthouse cottage, three unlikely allies had formed bonds that would prove stronger than any tempest Marcus Whitfield could unleash. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time in 30 years, Thomas Everett was fighting from a position of strength, with people he cared about depending on him, and with the truth as his most powerful weapon. The morning brought more than just an end to the storm. It brought Captain Rodriguez and a Coast Guard cutter, along with federal arrest warrants that Thomas's evidence had made possible after 3 decades of patient investigation. Marcus Whitfield was taken into custody for environmental crimes, conspiracy, tax evasion, and domestic violence charges. The trial that followed became a sensation in Boston legal circles, with Thomas's 30 years of evidence serving as the foundation for a comprehensive case that destroyed Marcus's empire of intimidation. Other victims came forward once his arrest became public, creating an avalanche of testimony that no amount of money or influence could stop. 6 months later, Thomas, Sarah, and Lucy had built a new life together in Beacon Harbor, Maine. Thomas found purpose in his work with the Environmental Protection Agency. Sarah's artistic talents flourished after years of suppression, and Lucy thrived in school, showing an aptitude for environmental science that made Thomas proud. Their wedding took place on the beach below their house, witnessed by their new community and officiated by Captain Rodriguez. As they exchanged vows, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. 30 years of solitude and dedication to justice that had prepared him for the moment when he could offer protection and love to 2 people who desperately needed both. The lighthouse still stood on its distant point, automated now, but no less important to the ships that depended on its guidance. Sometimes, on clear evenings, the 3 of them would walk out to visit it, Thomas sharing stories of his years as keeper, while Lucy collected shells and Sarah sketched the changing light on the water. Years later, when Lucy became an environmental lawyer specializing in cases against corporate polluters, she would tell people that her stepfather had taught her the most important lesson of her life: that justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing, but about protection for the innocent, hope for the hopeless, and the unshakable belief that good people, standing together, can overcome any darkness. The lighthouse keeper's promise had been kept, proving that some vows, once made with pure intention, echo through generations. The automated beacon continued to guide travelers safely home, just as Thomas's choice to stand up for what was right had guided his newfound family to safety, love, and justice. In a world that often seemed dark and dangerous, their story served as proof that there are still people willing to be lighthouses for others, guiding them safely through the storms of life to the harbor of home. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, justice, and family. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that even in our darkest moments, there are people willing to stand up for what's right, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Subscribe to Top Life Stories for more inspiring tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Remember, sometimes the greatest rescue missions aren't about saving ships from storms, but about saving hearts from despair. What lighthouse moment in your own life helped guide you home? Share your story in the comments below.